Vamos a dar paso a continuación a Philip Lane y Catherine Mann, que van a hablar sobre el régimen monetario de 1973 y las experiencias inflacionarias. Ya está en directo, vamos a escucharlo.
Have four current and former monetary policymakers, all of whom are also distinguished scholars. Let me introduce them in alphabetical order in the order in which it is stated, which they will speak. First is our colleague Jose de Gregorio, who, in addition to being a non-resident senior fellow here at PIIE, is the Dean of the School of Economics and Business at the University of Chile. He was governor of the Central Bank of Chile from 2007 to 2011 and vice governor from 2003. He had served on the bank's board from 2001. He also had his experience in 2000 and 2001 as the Minister of Combined Portfolios of Economy, Mining, and Energy in Chile. Recently, we published his book, How Latin America Weathered the Global Financial Crisis in 2014. Speaking second is Kristen Forbes, the Jerome and Dorothy Lemelson Professor of Management and Global Economics at MIT Sloan School. She served as an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England from 2014 to 17. She also served in the US Treasury and at the US Council of Economic Advisors in the early 2000s. And of course, she is a distinguished scholar on exchange rates and monetary policy. And for people in this room, many of you know her as the convener of the Bellagio group of officials in international economy. Speaking third is on the record, I'm appreciative, is our currently serving chief economist of the European Central Bank, Professor Philip Lane. He's, of course, a member of the executive board of the European Central Bank in that role. He's previously served as chair of the advisory technical committee of the European Systemic Risk Board and chair of the ESRB high-level task force on safe assets. He was, of course, governor of the Central Bank of Ireland and had a distinguished career in academia prior to that, including seminal work on global imbalances and international finance. Finally, alphabetically, another close colleague and alumna of the Peterson Institute, Dr. Catherine Mann. Catherine is currently an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. She started there in September of 2021. Prior to her appointment, she was global chief economist at Citibank from 2018 to 21, and chief economist, head of the economics department and G20 finance deputy at the OECD from 2014 to 2017. She had previously been a professor, or I guess is still considered a professor of the practice at Brandeis University, and has, as I mentioned, a period at the Federal Reserve and then at the Peterson Institute, which we are glad to recognize. So if I could ask the four speakers to come up, I will, like Maury, sit in the front row and give time signals. If you wish to speak from the podium, please feel free. We'll pretend the clicker works and take it from there. And first up, Jose, if you can come forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I have some slides. Well, they will appear, I hope so. So, well, it is a pleasure to be here. I have to talk like that. It's a pleasure to be here, and my first time at the Peterson after the pandemic, so it's great. I hope it will continue. I'll talk a little bit about what's going on and basically to just, well, okay, thanks. This is, you can do. I'll talk a bit about inflation and monetary policy and exchange rate regimes in emerging markets. Then I'll talk about two issues that I think that are quite relevant on exchange rate adjustment, and especially because what we think is that having flexible exchange rate has many costs, and especially in the emerging markets, but it helps the adjustment. And this adjustment, of course, many times has been questioned, and I want to talk about that. I think that I'm going the other way around. No, I got it. I think that the first thing, I don't know who's doing this. The first thing that it happened was the emerging market economies adopted flexible exchange rates much later than Bretton Woods ended. So this was by mid-late 1990s. And until mid-1990s, most crises in emerging markets were associated with rigidities in the exchange rate regime. We had the debt crisis in Latin America in the 1980s. We had the Mexican crisis in 1994. The Asian crisis, there was always some rigidity in the exchange rate. So there were two things that we have in the late 1990s. First, inflation decline, and there was a worldwide inflation decline, and high inflation Latin America, 1 digit everywhere around the world. Causality is a discussion that I won't take here, but many countries start adopting inflation targets, and there was a move, this is for emerging market, a move towards flexible exchange rate. The blue, spec exchange rates, then if you divide the green, which is the intermediate level, there are few freely floating exchange rate among emerging markets, but a lot of, I would say, managed float or white bands. But there has been much, much more flexibility. We don't know, as I said, what's causality, but one thing that was quite surprising and quite important during this period is that we observed a decline in the exchange rate pass-through to inflation. And this is this is basically a summary of a lot of evidence that has shown that the exchange rate pass-through has declined sharply in the short run, in the long run, among emerging markets. Today, a rough number we would say could be in the long run 0.2 depreciation with respect to the dollar, and this is even has happened in the period of very high exchange rate depreciations that we had during COVID, that we have during a taper tantrum and the global financial crisis. The effects on inflation have been much more muted. There are reasons. Taylor argued that with anchor inflation, we may have we would have a lower incentives for producers to pass through costs to prices. There are many other reasons why it's very different to change your prices when you're in a flexible exchange than when you're in a fixed exchange rate with infrequent devaluations. But that has been quite important. So what we have in this context, and I think that the first worry with this low pass-through, this environment in which exchange rate didn't affect that much domestic prices, was a discussion about external adjustment. In a world of local currency pricing, where you just all goods are priced in local currency, exchange rates do not play a role at all. So the thing that we were used to believe from Mandel Fleming and traditional models of external adjustment was questioned when we saw that there was a low pass-through from exchange rate to prices. Now, under dominant currency pricing, also the adjustment is limited. This is the most accepted view today, I would say. Changes in bilateral exchange rates do not affect external adjustment because it doesn't change relative prices, because prices are set in dollars. So let's say a Chilean exporter to Brazil, only changes real dollar will have effects on the price. And however, we have been looking this with some colleagues, and we have observed that, just to put a summary and tempt you to read the paper, then is we have in the short run DCP, a depreciation with respect to the dollar. The blue line is almost 1-to-1 because exports, let's say to Brazil, are denominated in dollars. However, as time goes on, this one declines, it's 0.3 in our estimations, and what becomes relevant over time is the bilateral exchange rate, so the relation between the real and the peso. And as we expect, in the red line, if there is a depreciation of the real with respect to the peso, Brazilians will export less, and the red line, we see a decline in export, which is what we were used to learn from standard Mandel Fleming. What is interesting, and I will not go into the details, is that also we would expect that if the price, you price in dollars and the price in Brazil goes up, we should export less. However, we see that the blue line is relatively stable, and we argue that there are supply effects. Chilean exporters find more, and this is quite a standard, find more profitable when there is a multilateral depreciation of the dollar. Despite the dollar and the real are the same, they want to export more to Brazil. Despite there is a decline in the demand for export, there is an increase in supply of imports. We are doing more of this, but I think that the exchange rate and what we show that still the exchange rate plays a very important role in the adjustment. And the second issue that has motivated, there were fear of floating this idea by Calvin Reinhardt for two reasons. One was inflation, and we saw exchange rate pass-through had declined. There was no reason to have that a fear of floating because of inflation. And the second reason was mismatches, was that we borrow in dollars, we lend in pesos, a depreciation of the dollar will make us poor, we will have a financial collapse. It's chaos is coming. So that's, first of all, I have to say that there is not that much evidence of pervasive and dramatic currency mismatches in emerging markets. Some firms borrow in dollars, they hate themselves, but we have not, and this I think beyond the academic evidence and papers, the fact that there has been large fluctuations in exchange rate in the last 20 years, without severe financial problems, is a practical evidence that we do not observe that much currency mismatch. We had global financial crisis, 30, 40% depreciation in emerging markets. There was inflation, there was no financial. Then we have the taper tantrum. We were very scared because there was this announcement by the Fed, caused turmoil everywhere. We were floating. I don't see. There are some special countries. I will always when we talk about Latin America, we have to exclude Argentina and Venezuela. Okay, that's fine. And then there are some other countries. But in general, we don't observe. And then we have COVID. There was a lot of government support, but we have COVID, and there was no huge crisis. So we have to, and what I will show you is that the evidence, this is the case of Chile, and I was extremely surprised, and I think that's very interesting. Chile had this is the net international investment position, the blue line. The red line is accumulated current account. Despite having accumulated deficit current account growing in 2019, in 2020, what we observe is that the net international investment position improved. Why? Because there was a sharp depreciation. Chile is short in dollars. The government is short in dollars. Firms are short in dollars. And there was a depreciation. And also remember that we had a social unrest, total chaos, close to a revolution, very bad performance of our stock market compared to that of the US. And most of the difference is explained by valuation effects because being an internationally financially open economy has served as insurance with all the costs that have. So I think that this is not just Chile. We're doing, and I may show you soon, a panel data for all emerging markets, and this happened in most countries. More open countries financially, they have more asset and liabilities, so the valuation effects become more important. Let me just close. I have 20 seconds to say that flexible exchange rates, inflation targets, and low inflation have brought many benefits to emerging markets. With few exceptions, we have not seen large financial or macro collapses since the early 2000s. The emerging market weathered very well the global financial crisis, then the COVID crisis. Still, we have the big problem how to make emerging markets to grow faster. That's not the macro problem, is the long-term problem. By looking at the Euro crisis some years ago, the most recent financial turmoil in the US, it seems that emerging markets are having much better macroeconomic and financial performance than advanced economies, thanks to flexibility, pragmatism, and a little bit of prudence. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks, Adam and Maury and Doug for including me in this event. This has been a great motivation to take a step back and think about how different exchange rate regimes have been performing over the past 50 years. So the topic of this panel is supposed to be inflation experiences. So I'm going to focus on one narrow aspect of that, and that is if we have been able to replace what was called the golden anchor to achieve price stability in the post-Bretton Woods anchor or post-Bretton Woods regime. And by golden anchor, I mean obviously the Bretton Woods.
Bueno, como ven, estamos escuchando varias intervenciones sobre distintos medios y sobre la política monetaria actual en distintas regiones. Acabamos de escuchar sobre Chile, a la espera todavía de que hable Philip R. Lane y Catherine Mann.
Book by Jeff Garton, 3 Days at Camp David, when he details the debates about what could replace the Bretton Woods system and was the system appeared cracked. He writes that Volcker believed that money needed an anchor, some price that was a fixed point and that an exchange rate tied to gold served that purpose. He was convinced that fixed currencies imparted a necessary discipline on national policymakers who otherwise would too easily resort to easy policies that would lead to inflation. So major concern was what's going to anchor prices if we give up on this golden anchor of the Bretton Woods system. Now, if these policymakers could look forward to what was going to happen in terms of the rapid pace of globalization in the 1990s and 2000s through trade, capital flows, supply chains, they might have even been more worried about losing this anchor. Because as a number of researchers have shown, including a paper I did for an institution across the street, we're increasingly seeing that inflation is driven by global factors, by global shocks. So if policymakers back in the 1960s had seen how inflation is going to deviate substantially from targets because of these external global shocks, they probably would have been even more concerned about losing this anchor for price stability. So what I'm going to do is try to answer this question. In the post-Bretton Woods era, have countries been able to find a new anchor for achieving price stability in the face of these large global shocks? And to try to get at that, I'm going to look at some different pieces of evidence, focusing on advanced economies. So in contrast to Jose's comments, I'm just going to focus on advanced economies due to data limitations, although I'll comment briefly on emerging markets at the end. And I'm going to compare how countries with more flexible exchange rate regimes have done compared to countries with more rigid exchange rate regimes in terms of their inflation rate, their sensitivity of inflation to common global factors, and then look specifically in their inflation sensitivity to specific global shocks. And what I'm going to conclude is that at least in advanced economies, some have been able to replace the anchor of having a pegged exchange rate with some other sort of anchor and been able to achieve just as much price stability as countries that have maintained some sort of pegged exchange rate. So let me jump right in. So I'm going to, again, show you a bunch of comparisons. Advanced economies only. I'm going to focus on the last 20 to 25 years, so the second half of the post-Bretton Woods era, so the period when all of the adjustments we heard about in the last panel have sorted themselves out, and the regime looks something like it does today. And let's look at inflation rates for some different countries. So blue is the average CPI inflation rate for advanced economies, big set of about 33 advanced economies. And then I'm going to break that down into two subsets of the advanced economies. Green is countries that have a rigid exchange rate, where rigid is defined as a conventional peg currency board or no separate legal tender, i.e. Euro countries. Red is countries that have maintained more flexible exchange rates, basically some form of a floating exchange rate. And when you look at average inflation for these different groups of countries, there's not much difference. Yes, there's big movements in average inflation, but there don't appear to be big differences in terms of countries that have abandoned an anchor of a fixed exchange rate versus those with flexible exchange rates. If anything, if you calculate the deviations, countries that have maintained a more rigid exchange rate do a little bit worse in terms of deviating from 2% targets. Countries with no anchor have done a little bit better, but those differences are pretty minor. So first pass, countries that abandon the anchor don't seem to have done any worse in terms of meeting inflation targets. Second test, what about sensitivity of inflation to shared global factors, now that global factors are a bigger driver of inflation? So look at the same groups of countries. And now what I do is take out the first principal component of CPI inflation, calculated over 4-year rolling averages. So what this basically shows is how correlated inflation is in each of these countries with inflation in other advanced economies? How much does your inflation rate co-move with inflation of other advanced economies? And the first thing that jumps out is just this upward slope in this graph. And this captures what's been documented in other work, that the global factors are becoming more and more important in driving inflation. Just to put some numbers on it, in the mid-2000s, about 50% of the movement in inflation in an advanced economy was correlated with movement in inflation in other advanced economies. In 2022, 90% of changes in your inflation rates in advanced economies was correlated with changes in inflation in other advanced economies. So there's a big shared global pattern in inflation now in advanced economies. But then again, if you break down what's happening on average in advanced economies in blue to those that have abandoned the anchor of a fixed exchange rate in red, countries with a flexible exchange rate, you don't see that they are any more vulnerable to this shared global shocks driving inflation. If anything, in the mid-2010s, they look less vulnerable. So countries that have again abandoned the anchor seem to have even more idiosyncratic component of inflation. They aren't more affected by these global shocks than countries that have maintained an anchor. So at least on that second test, it looks like abandoning the anchor hasn't hurt them and made countries more vulnerable to external shocks. So these are nice comparisons, but it doesn't really tell you how vulnerable countries are to specific global shocks. So for a final piece of analysis or final piece of evidence, I go to estimating some Phillips Curve regressions. And I'm going to build on work I did with Joe Gagnon, sitting right there, and Chris Collins, who also helped me update these regressions. And what I'm going to do is just estimate standard New Keynesian Phillips Curve models. I'm going to first show you I'm not going to, I have lots of numbers. I won't put them all up here. I'll just show you the key results and key findings. So first row, and I'm going to show you 4 specifications. First one just shows that there's nothing funky going on here. This just estimates the standard model. This looks at quarterly inflation, advanced economies, and inflation is seasonally adjusted. And when you estimate standard New Keynesian Phillips Curve panel of about 30 advanced economies, you get the expected signs, everything's significant. What this means is if you have more slack, red means the coefficient is negative. More slack, you have lower inflation, as you'd expect. And if you have higher inflation expectations or higher lagged inflation, you tend to have higher inflation. So as expected, nothing funky going on. Then I re-estimate the model that I used as the baseline in the paper with Joe, where we add 2 things. We add nonlinearity for the Phillips curve, and we use a specification that allows the Phillips curve to be flat when you have slack in the economy, and then the Phillips curve gets steeper when you have less slack. And then we also control for specific global factors that influence inflation. So when I add those extra controls, you get everything comes in as expected in terms of sign and largely significant. And again, what the coefficients on slack show you is that when you have slack, the Phillips curve basically flattens. And then you get expected signs on the global variables. When you have more global slack, you have less inflation. When you have a growth of global value chains, you have less inflation. When you have a higher oil price inflation or commodity X oil price inflation, you tend to have higher inflation. So all expected, nothing new here, just showing that the sort of standard results hold up. Now I'm going to show you the new thing relevant to this panel. What has happened when you adopted a flexible exchange rate or a fixed exchange rate in this post-Bretton Woods era? Does that make you more sensitive to the global shocks? So to test that, I'm going to interact each of the global variables with a dummy variable if you have a flexible exchange rate or if you have a rigid exchange rate. And that's shown in the parts that are have a rectangle around them in red. The fact those coefficients are light and generally don't have stars means they're generally not significant. And what that means is if you adopted a flexible exchange rate, then you are not more sensitive to global shocks than any other countries. Even though you don't have an anchor, you're not more sensitive to these big global shocks, which are increasingly important in driving inflation. Same with countries that maintain an anchor. They kept a peg exchange rate. They aren't any less vulnerable or more vulnerable to these big global shocks, which increasingly affect inflation. The only exception is this coefficient on the far right, the green one for flexible exchange rate and global value chains. That comes in positive, but that basically counteracts the coefficient above, which means global value chains seem to have had less effect on countries with flexible exchange rates. So if anything, they're better anchored, not worse anchored. But overall, and I've also done this for core inflation, and you get the same results. When you estimate what's driving core inflation in a sort of Phillips curve model, you find that core inflation is less affected by global variables in general, but there's no significant difference for countries that have abandoned the anchor and have a flexible exchange rate. So let me tie that all together. What's it all mean? My takeaway from this is that pegs haven't been needed to anchor prices, at least in advanced economies in the post-Bretton Woods era. Inflation in countries that abandoned the anchor and went for flexible exchange rates has not been any worse in terms of meeting inflation targets. The sensitivity of inflation to common global factors often hasn't been any also hasn't been any greater, and the sensitivity of countries without an anchor to global shocks also hasn't been any greater. So it looked to me, at least in these sort of rough comparisons, that the shift has been largely a success. The loss of the golden anchor from the Bretton Woods era has not undermined price stability in advanced economies, despite the growing role of large global shocks that push inflation away from targets for brief periods of time. So these concerns that I started with, that Volker talked about losing the anchor if they could maintain price stability, haven't played out. And of course, the answer is probably what was discussed briefly in the first panel, raised by Larry and Richard mentioned, is that it appears that this, what was the anchor in terms of the being linked to gold and the dollar, has been replaced by the stone columns of independent inflation targeting central banks. These independent inflation targeting central banks seem to have been able to provide the anchor for price stability that was previously accomplished through the peg in the Bretton Woods era. So all in all, fairly successful outcome, at least based on these rough comparisons. But I did want to end with one caveat, because I'm an economist, you can't be all positive, there's always downsides. And the one caveat was for if I try to replicate this for emerging markets. The results are less strong for emerging markets. Maybe Jose could comment on this in the panel at the end. I can't replicate all of the analysis I just showed you for emerging markets because there's not sufficient data. But at least the parts I could replicate raise some questions of whether emerging markets have been as successful at anchoring inflation without pegging their exchange rate. And here's just the one comparison I'll end on. This is the chart I started with, CPI inflation for advanced economies with rigid exchange rates in green, more flexible in red, no big difference in advanced economies. Do the same thing for a large sample of emerging markets. Now, purple is average inflation for emerging markets as a whole. Red is those with very floating exchange rates. Green is those with very rigid exchange rates. And now you see some big differences. Emerging markets that have adopted floating exchange rates have hit inflation further away from targets. Rigid exchange rates seem to provide more of an anchor. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this event today. What I would say is, I mean, Adam had a very intriguing introduction about what's the fuss. Let me say also, 1973 to now, I mean, it's been brought up in different contributions. You could also frame that in different ways. You could talk about the trend in North Star, as Richard was doing. You talk about the trend in globalization. You talk about the amazing convergence to low and stable inflation rates.
Vamos a escuchar ya a Philip Lane del Banco Central Europeo con su presentación sobre la política monetaria en Europa y la inflación.
So the question is, how does that connect to the movement away from the Bretton Woods system? And I suppose that one of the basic points I want to say is that was not, at some level it was 0-1. So the remarkable New York Times front page you started with. But another level, and again, if you zoom back, and maybe if you go forward maybe another 20, 30 years and people look backwards, they would say, okay, is 1973 the event? Or is it something like maybe from the mid-60s actually, maybe running all the way, and I'm going to use 2015 as actually my number. So 2015, that period, at least in the European context, is really a huge learning period. Lots of decisions along the way about, okay, what's next? How do we replace the system that was there with a new system? And essentially, I do give this kind of I mean, the discipline of the Peterson Institute in saying 5 slides does mean I'm not going to go through it. But what I'm going to say here is from a European perspective, there's a big learning episode in the 1970s about, okay, what's next in terms of snakes and so on. Then with the EMS from 79 onwards, which of course, after the currency crisis of the early 90s, there was a question, okay, what's next? And then towards the end of 95, okay, let's go for monetary union. But then monetary union from day one was not exactly perfect. And I dated myself all the way to 2015, summer 2015, thinking about okay, now that we've experienced some crises, how are we going to run this in a more stable way? What kind of ancillary policies do we need? And so this goes all the way through the Greece referendum in June, July 2015. And of course, I came in October 2015. So all of that learning episode was behind us in some way. And if you like, in the last number of years, the challenges Europe has faced in my time has been essentially big common challenges. For a long time is how are we going to deal with below target inflation using unconventional policy? Then, of course, we had the pandemic quite recently, and then the last couple of years, this above target inflation shock, which has involved the end of QE and also the hiking cycle. So in terms of that, that's point number one, it's not 0-1. There's a long period there of monetary instability in some sense, or monetary regime instability. Look at the amount of, I mean, of course, the careers of many of us here were spent on all of those episode by episode, whether it's incremental adjustments or big bang adjustments, such as monetary union. And one way to think about it is here we are in March 23, which is 50 years of the end of Bretton Woods. In May 23, we'll be celebrating 25 years of the ECB. Because of course the ECB was set up and we're planning for that. And so half of this period since the end of Bretton Woods from a European perspective has been under monetary union. And again, my working day is basically spent on the assumption the relevant part of monetary union is 2015 onwards, when a lot of this is shaken out. And Maury also already mentioned the trilemmas. I mean, the issue is, I mean, I agree with Kristen, what she just said about you can deliver low inflation in many ways. So it's not about the ability to deliver, but it's basically how do you manage these various trilemmas, the monetary policy trilemma, the financial stability trilemma, and then the political economy trilemma, which of course I think is also a Peterson product from Danny Roderick's book from probably 25 years ago now. And the unique answer in Europe was monetary union. So it's this fuzzy concept. Let's not go for one of the corners of that triangle. Let's create essentially a shared system. So, okay, for many purposes, what Kristen did about let's classify it in a certain sense as a fixed exchange rate. To some extent, sometimes you can do, but fundamentally, we have a common currency. And how that works with a governing council now with 26 members, and again, with so many countries involved. And we all know, we knew then, and we still know, it's obviously a lot easier if the shocks are mostly common shocks, and a lot more difficult if the shocks are country-specific shocks. And then this idea of country-specific shocks, there's really two types. One is basically asymmetric shocks, and these can happen. The question is, in the ratio of the overall type of shocks that hit economies, how important are they? And some shocks were important in this period, like the rise of China was asymmetric across Europe, for sure, But also a lot of asymmetric shocks are really asymmetric policy errors. And if you can avoid those policy errors at the national level, then the common monetary policy can be more effective. Okay, so then in this period, I think it's fair to say pretty big common shocks and common trends. The trend in the real interest rate, the global factor in the business cycle, as Kristen was mentioning, the pandemic, the war now that we have, the energy shock and upcoming, and now climate change and various geopolitical trends and shocks and trends. And basically all the time, I asked the staff, I asked everyone, okay, show me the counterfactual. How would we deal with all of these with 19 extra currencies in Europe? Would this really make policy making as effective? I'm sure they would all deliver low inflation by hook and by crook. But in terms of the efficiency of policy making, it's a local solution in the sense that it does internalize the intra-area spillovers. So Richard mentioned the issue about competitive devaluations, even calibrating monetary policy. So Maury's work last autumn about watch out for spillovers. Of course, we also have to watch out for global spillovers. But the internal spillover across Europe, if we had 19 extra monetary policies, would be quite something. And I would want to emphasize, it's already come up with Jose, that essentially if you have this zone, which is big enough, that essentially the euro is the currency of pricing. It's the currency of trade within the euro area. It's the currency of importing into the euro area. And it's the currency of finance. A lot of the issues about which you might be concerned about volatility are limited. Let me emphasize, analytically, the euro is the anchor for the wider European system. I'll show you that in a minute. And then also, I would say, trying to keep the time, of course, I focused on a lot of intra-European issues, but of course, we pay great attention to all of the global spillovers. And I'm not going to show charts today, but I mean, maybe over the course of today and tomorrow, I mean, how the global system works, and we've seen this again this week, is underpinned by swap lines among the major currencies. And just thinking about the ability of those countries involved in organizing that system is really do we have a system? Do we not have a system? We do have a system, and it's underpinned by the major central banks working together in that sense. Okay, so here are some of the pictures. One is basically again the dominance of the euro as a regional currency. So most of the trade for Europe is in euro. Most of the trade beyond just the euro area is in euro. So in that sense, it's this regionally dominant currency. And it's important, honestly, for me, when we think about movements in exchange rates and how they matter and so on, how they matter for trade. I mean, what Jose said, I fully agree with. Like over time, this issue doesn't matter so much how you invoice because the macro takes over. But for a lot of this, it's quite important. And on the right, you see country by country, it's very important. And let me make a kind of a glancing comment here about the last couple of years and how countries in Europe have been responding to the inflation challenge with monetary policy. Now, you can do this in different ways. So here in the horizontal axis is basically the surge in inflation. Here in this chart is since the start of 22, maybe I should have gone to mid-21, which is more when the surge started. And the vertical axis is the cumulative change in interest rates. And maybe one basic point here is essentially, with the exception of Hungary, which is has its own journey up in the upper quadrant, essentially interest rates have not, they definitely moved earlier than the ECB, but in the grand scheme of things, the interest rate responses have clearly been anchored by what the ECB has done, even though the inflation challenge has been quite different. I think this connects back to the anchor role of the ECB in the European system. Okay, so let me, having raced through that, and I hope in the panel discussion we can come back to some of this, it is essentially when we think about the history over a longer horizon, for me, only in the recent years have we started to see a more mature version of the euro. And the question of under what circumstances does this, how costly has it been? How beneficial has it been for countries to join the euro? And I think in terms of the trade-offs, the joint ability to respond to common shocks does mean it's increasingly popular. It's pretty high and stable level of popularity. for the euro, more than the ECB, I should say, but for the euro as a common currency, people like it. There is not any big kind of alternative narrative to that. Second point I want to say is, again, it's an anchor for the region, not just for the euro area. All of this did require, and this was the learning over 10 and 15 years, ancillary policies. Macro-PRU, micro-PRU, common supervision, the European fiscal framework. It's not over. We clearly think more needs to be done in terms of banking union, capital markets union, and some central fiscal capacity. And then, as Richard already mentioned, we're in a new phase now of digital currencies. And just imagine if the European debate was talking about, 19 extra digital currencies. We all know with digital currencies, the issue is going to be more severe for small countries in terms of potential of substitution. So for the euro, again, this digital phase, I think will come back to the value of a common monetary policy and essentially losing the floating exchange at the national level. For the unique circumstance of Europe, counter maybe to the global trend, I think that this is turning out to be a stable approach. Let me stop there.
Well, hi, everybody. It's really great to be back here at Peterson. And I think what I'm going to be saying in my remarks here are bringing together quite a bit of the themes that were already in the panel. So maybe it's just that great minds think alike. And so we are all kind of focused on the same set of issues. But I'm going to talk a little bit about 50 years of exchange rate pass-through. It's a really large topic, so I decided to take the advantage of you note on the title there that I was in the International Finance Division with, of course, Ted, for quite a few years at the beginning of my career, and now where I am at the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. So I sort of have a bookends of this looking at exchange rate pass-through. So in the early floating period, sort of at the first 10 years or so, really the only thing that we focused on was, how much did the exchange rate move? How did it affect import prices? And then, following on from there, affecting CPI or whatever the preferred measure of inflation was. And, maybe there were periods of time where we might look at trade-weighted exchange rates, or maybe we look at bilateral exchange rates. We might have used methodologies that went directly from the exchange rate changes to the CPI. Maybe we looked at intermediate methodologies and tested whether some of those coefficients of the exchange rate pass-through was equal to 1 or wasn't. But, that was sort of like the first 10 years, I'd say. Then, when exchange rate pass-through met the IO, industrial organization, in other words, there was a real major research explosion, which we're really addressing as well right now. And I just had to give you this first paragraph of my 1986 Federal Reserve Bulletin article on sort of the, as I say, prices, profit margins, and exchange rates. This was industrial organization. This was disaggregated data, which I had to handwrite out from microfiche. And so it was, about the exchange value of the dollar declining from its peak. How is it going to affect domestic inflation? This pass-through relationship had been stable, a point that I will return to at the end when asking the question whether it will continue to be that way, and whether or not, for example, volatility in exchange rates mattered. So we can kind of think about how the questions have remained the same. It's just that the data that we apply to them have improved. So I'd like to, going back to what new things I'm going to add is first the shocks, which have already been discussed a little bit, but I'm going to talk about them again, and then definitely come back to the role that central banks play in exchange rate pass-through. It's already been mentioned a number of times, but I think I have a couple different charts. So, there is so much research on these topics that one has to decide who's kind of generated the best charts, and who's also going to be at the event. And so this is both a great chart pack, as well as it's from Kristen's work when she was on the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. And what this work does, and I think it really opened up a very broad set of research. It's from 2015, and there has been a lot of research since then, but this is for the UK, and it basically shows how the two pieces of exchange rate pass through, from exchange rates into import prices, and the second step from import prices into the CPI, depends on the nature of the shock. I think we need to continue to look at both of those steps of the exchange rate process, exchange rate pass-through process. So what these charts do is taking a 1% appreciation of the sterling, so that's what we're doing in this particular example, what generated that appreciation, and that is on the left-hand side, and then what are the implications for CPI, which is in the right-hand panel. And you can see that depending on which generated the original shock, you end up with some dramatically different outcomes, both on the first stage of import pass-through, exchange rate pass-through to import prices, and then the second stage to CPI. Now, what these charts do, which I think is a very clever way of showing these charts, is it is showing you essentially the elasticity. It's in a VAR context, so it's not a structural time series estimation, but it's showing you the impact effect and then the time series effect of this, the nature of the relationship between the two phases, the export price, exchange rates to import prices, and then along to CPI. So, for example, if we just look at a blue line here, comparing the two, that would be a UK demand shock. It does is associated with this appreciation, which reduces import prices. You can see that on the left-hand side. But then what happens when we take that demand shock, and including the import price effect, and we end up on the right-hand side to show that domestic inflation, even in the face of an appreciation, is robust in the face of a demand shock, so that the demand effect is outweighing both the imported price effect as well as the pass-through. So here's a case of where in sort of IO terms, do the domestic producers get to take advantage of both a reduced cost of inputs and then price higher once it gets into the domestic market. Now, another example that I think is an interesting one to consider here is the green line. That's where the appreciation of the pound was due to a domestic, let's see, green is the domestic supply shock, another interesting situation for the UK. And in this case, you end up with this was a positive global domestic shock, reducing import prices again, say it's a productivity shock. And in this case, the impact on domestic prices is, of course, dramatically different. So this is a case of where the underpinnings of the supply shock show up both at the first stage and then at the second stage of the pass-through. So turning now to sort of the central banking part of this, I think what one of the points that has been brought out in a number of cases is the reduced role of exchange rate pass-through, and somehow that this is it doesn't really matter anymore, that exchange rate pass-through is not an important question. And perhaps that's why when Adam listed up what were important issues on the PII website, there wasn't exchange rates weren't a vocabulary word there. And one can argue that, well, maybe it doesn't matter anymore. This is taken from a paper from the IMF, which is looking at how exchange rate pass-through has changed over time, over pretty short period of time, really, with the pass-through into 12 months being in the purple, and then pass through in the longer period, 2 years being in the black bar. Over all of this time period, you can see the exchange rate pass through really is no longer very interesting. It's all small. It hasn't really, it's no longer a big driver of the underlying state of inflation in economies. Now, is this just the great moderation? Is this just because of central bank credibility and inflation targeting? Well, maybe. And since we are all credible as central bankers, maybe we will be able to continue to be credible in the face of the shocks that we're going to be observing here over the next few years. The digging down on central bank credibility and digging down on a central bank's perspective is to argue that exchange rate pass-through is essentially endogenous to central bank policy. And this is an example taken from a speech middle of last year, where I evaluated the extent to which exchange rate pass-through, which is in the middle chart, and then effect on consumer prices in the right-hand chart, how that is related to a reaction function of the Bank of England generated by the data, which is in the solid blue line, and then two other reaction functions, either an activist reaction function of the central bank policymaker or a gradualist one. So let me just step through this quickly. And that is, we were facing a situation where, let's say there was monetary tightening in the neighborhood. In this example, it was monetary tightening in the United States. And then what would be a logical, what would be a response by the central bank in the UK? So the blue line, as I say, the dark blue line is generated off of the actual data, the implied reaction function of the Bank of England from the data. And you can see that this reaction function there is monetary tightening. It does lead to, you can see it initially tightens in the UK by about 25 basis points. And then there's a loosening following thereafter. What that does to sterling is to initial appreciation of the sterling in the dark blue line, but not very much. And the overall inflationary outcome on the right-hand panel is one of higher inflation, higher price level, actually. Now, the two alternative reaction functions were either activists raising the domestic policy rate by the full amount, 100 basis points, or to gradually step up in the dotted blue line. The inflation outcomes, the sterling outcomes in the center, a lot more sterling reaction from an activist approach versus the gradualist approach, and the inflation outcomes or the price level outcomes on the right-hand panel being dramatically different as well. So to stabilize price levels in the face of a spillover coming from abroad, an activist approach would have stabilized the price level. And then just to conclude, for some future work, as this chart is taken from, I don't see Carmen out there yet, so. Okay, well, as I was saying, taking the charts, you can see the extent to which exchange rate volatility has dramatically fallen. GDP-weighted inflation has dramatically fallen, but look at the title of the paper. The reason why this matters is that the research frontier for exchange rate pass-through, in my view, has to look at asymmetries, ups versus downs being mattering. Volatility is probably going to be higher, not lower. There are thresholds that firms look at when considering whether and when to change their prices. And I also would hope that there would be a stronger marrying of the Helene Ray work, the financial flows and risk, and into the pricing strategy, which plays a central role in exchange rate pass-through. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. If I could ask our four distinguished panelists to make a panel. Sorry to be the time police, but given the quality of people in the room, we want as much discussion as possible. As I would say, as usual at the Peterson Institute, but we're a little out of practice on in-person meetings. There is a moving mic up front with our meetings coordinator, Jessica, and there is a standing mic in back. I'm not going to pose any questions because the audience is good, but first I'm going to ask whether, starting with Jose, you wanted to make any response to subsequent speakers, especially since I think Kristen specifically referred to you at the end of her talk.
Just one comment that I'm very surprised because we have been talking about how the exchange rate pass-through had changed over time. One of the things that I was doing preparing for this talk was to check the pass-through for the current very high inflation. And if you correlate them, it's 1-to-1. But so because it's an inflationary shock, it's not exchange rate shock. So I think that we have to be extremely careful. I haven't seen the recent evidence, but yeah, we have to be careful. We're evaluating what are the true exchange rate pass-through because indigeneity and causality may go the other way around. That was it.
Thank you. That you're as always extremely concise, I'll say. Kristen, Catherine took your prior work in not in vain, very much in spirit. Is there anything you would like to respond to from Philip or Catherine?
Actually, I had what I'd like to see done, which I'm sure neither of you have done yet, but a good agenda for future work is Catherine highlighted, there's now the evidence that the extent of exchange rate pass-through varies based on the shock, why the exchange rate has moved a lot. But then both Catherine and Jose mentioned that exchange rate pass-through seems to have fallen in the late 2010s. But my take on that was part of the reason exchange rate pass-through had fallen was the nature of the shocks was different. You didn't have some of the major shocks in the 2010s, which are correlated with more pass-through. But it seems like we have just had a tremendous natural experiment in terms of some massive global shocks, some massive supply shocks in the last 3 years. And at least in this earlier work you cited, supply shocks often have much greater pass-through. And that could be a factor contributing to high pass-through from exchange rate depreciations into inflation, and why inflation is more persistent in some countries. So I just wonder if either of you would comment on that, if that fit with what you looked at, although my guess is you haven't actually estimated it yet.
Well, the low pass-through, a very old story. I see Holger Wolf, we work at that time together, and I realized that the pass-through were extremely low. The first time was for the Euro crisis of the late 1990s. I just talk an anecdote. When you become older, you can tell anecdotes. I was at the IMF in the team of Italy and Spain that were in the EMS joining the Euro. And I came from Latin America, and I so I said, well, and they were extremely afraid because they said if we have a devaluation and we do a readjustment, pass-through will be 1-to-1. So I remember I said to a famous policymaker now, but in Latin America it didn't happen this. You don't have 1-to-1, but this is Europe. So that's fine. So that was
Anecdotes can be good. This is good.
At that time there was a huge adjustment of currencies in the early 1990s. There was no inflation and rapid growth in Europe.
Thank you. I'll just say, if somebody wants to do that study for the Peterson Institute, that would be good too. Philip, you brought in, as we expected, an absolutely critical, important perspective about what Europe has done and tried to make it fit into the overall framework without overselling it, and we appreciate that. Given playing time cop in your dense 5 slides, is there any other point you'd like to make before we open to the general discussion?
Well, maybe just again, thinking about natural experiments and also ways to kind of understand the world. I mean, the euro is also, because we know is a big political motivation to form it. So thinking about, we now have 25 years of data of the euro. So thinking about, for example, exchange rate behavior, spillovers. So let me call out a few different things, both from life as an academic researcher and then something we see day by day. Number one, the real exchange rates within the euro area are much less noisy, obviously, because we don't have national currencies. And over time, what you see is the trend in those real exchange rates do a good job of matching productivity, the terms of trade, and so on. So in other words, if you clean out the noise of nominal volatility, models of exchange rates that you might run on a real basis show up. What is also true is across Europe, across the euro area, the inflation differentials across the member countries highly correlate with trade-weighted exchange rates. Because of course, all countries have different trade patterns around the world. So in the sense of but I wouldn't locate it necessarily as just mechanical pass-through. It's more, as Kristen just said, about the shocks that generate swings in the external value of the euro and how that affects countries differently. What I would say is, and again, when you think about this, for a lot of macro and different central banks differ about how closely they adhere to this analytical framework, differentiating essentially the local non-traded component of inflation versus the tradable sector. And the tradable sector, I mean, Cathy's 1986 Federal Reserve Bulletin, it's exchange rates, profit margins, and profit margins is a big story in Europe at the moment. And the connection between global prices. Of course, if the global price of tradable goods shoots up and you're a European producer, your cost base doesn't necessarily change. And it's going to pass through one for one into profits in some sectors. So I would say the margin of profit margins, I think, is quite important. On the asymmetry, let me mention two asymmetries, because we just had a big increase in costs, and now that's reversing. One is the intersection with financial constraints. Absolutely, last year, the scale, so it's not so much, the scale of the shock was so big, various firms would just have shut down if they did not pass through immediately the price increase. In reverse, you don't have the same bankruptcy constraint. So when the input cost falls, then it's going to be a market structure issue, a competitive pressure issue. But in the other direction, absolutely last year, it was basically, if we don't raise prices, it's over. So that kind of basic solvency constraint, I'm sure, has mattered quite a bit. But I also agree with Cathy, it also depends on the monetary policy reaction as well, how exchange rates respond. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Philip. Catherine, given the discussion, anything you want to add?
So the one thing I want to emphasize.
Could you turn on your mic, please?
Right. The one thing that I think I want to emphasize is ultimately exchange rate pass through both at the first stage and the second stage is a function of firms' pricing strategies. One of the things that we have learned with looking at our decision maker panel, which is a publicly available thing, is that firms' pricing is very much related to the skew and the distribution of the prices in the survey itself. So it's not just a matter of sort of average input costs or average exchange rate movements. It's very related to the skew and to the dispersion. What that means, and why I brought up that last slide, is this: we may have been living through a period here over the last 20 years where we've been able to pat ourselves on the back. Oh, the great moderation, central bank inflation targeting and credibility. All of this has, collectively enabled us to keep inflation low. To the extent that what we are now observing is much more volatility in exchange rates, especially financial determined exchange rates as opposed to the trade weighted ones, and much more volatility in inflation and much higher dispersion in inflation across different product categories and therefore across different firms, that we may well be entering a very different regime where we're going to have to work much harder as central banks in order to rein in and tighten in the distributions that firms are facing when they're making their pricing decisions.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, again, let's open it up to questions and comments from the floor. Raise your hand near the front if you'd like the roving mic. Stand up near the back if you can, near the standing mic, and please identify yourself. Please.
Hi, I'm Lou Alexander from Rocos Capital Management. Thanks very much. Great panel. I actually have a couple questions. One for Jose. I was struck by your comments about the last 20 years exchange. We've had a lot of fluctuation in exchange rates and relatively little connection back to emerging market crises. As someone who kind of lived through the Asian financial crisis in the 90s, that was quite striking. To what extent was that a private sector response, that the private sector just decided they didn't want to have the kinds of exposures we had previously? Or to what extent was it a successful public sector response? But as you noted, I think it's a big success. I think for the rest of the panel, as we think about how the major economies respond to these big shocks that we're having, these big global shocks, I am struck by the fact that there are structural differences in the economies that also affect these things. And so it's not just the distribution of the shocks that matters. I have to say, sitting in London, you see what's going on in labor markets. London and Paris looks very different than what's going on in Berlin or Japan, for example. And so I'm curious, how should we think about those differences? And I just have to say one thing for Philip. On your list of things, I was struck that you didn't have German unification and its run into the ERM crises. Like, obviously, that's a very unusual set of shocks, but it had very specific consequences. I've been sitting here trying to think whether or not Ukraine could generate something of that magnitude, and I think probably not. But it is a relevant case, it seems to me. Thanks.
Thanks, Lou. Who would like to, anybody like to respond?
Just very briefly, after so many crises and so, I think that there is a strong regulation and very prudent. So I think that there is a role for public policy. But I think, and this is just by stories that you hear, that people that get very hurt with past financial crises, and that's well known, and they become a little bit more prudent. Then I think, why in the US we had so financial crisis very recently, and it seems that people forget, well, must be more, we need more sociological argument. But I think that there are differences that are striking.
Lou, I'll answer your second question, that the structure of economy should matter for pass-through of, say, exchange rate movements, adjustments, as well as the specific shocks. You're exactly right. I actually, in this work that Kathy nicely cited, a second paper I wrote in the series of papers was actually called Shocks versus Structure. And I tried to separate out what's the role of shocks versus the role of structure. And if I remember correctly, what we found is that in terms of the average level of exchange rate pass-through across countries, the structure of the economy is most important. If you're in the euro and all other aspects, financial system development, your structure matters. But in terms of why pass-through changes over time within countries, that's where the shocks come in and can matter quite a bit. So both matter, but you're exactly right. The structure is most important in terms of the average level of pass-through in response to external shocks.
Thank you. Phil?
I mean, I think it's always true, but of course, the cliche of sometimes decades pass slowly and sometimes decades happen within a short amount of weeks in the sense of the momentum. I did have on my list geopolitics. So in the sense of when I think about the shocks hitting the world or hitting Europe, geopolitics. So whether at one phase it was within Europe, the formation of the EU, German unification for sure. And then honestly for the EU area to work out, what is it prepared to do? Is it prepared to set up the ESM? Is it prepared to have a single supervisor? Lots of things happened within Europe. I suppose I was saying maybe that phase within the euro area was basically, I think, more or less concluded in that phase. There's more to do, maybe around 2015. But then looking ahead, these are some of the biggest potential sources of shocks hitting the economy. Let me mention, which I think is a general issue, is about structural change in the economy and the effect of monetary policy. Definitely one of the topics we're mentioning, and President Lagarde mentioned it yesterday at the Watcher speech, is there are changes in the financial system. But one of the big changes in the world is, I suppose, the rise of the tech industry here and in Europe and around the world. And thinking about the economics of tech, the economics of intangible capital, the role of basically earnings in the distant future discounted to today, and how interest rates work in that world compared to the world where historically you might think about interest rate sensitive manufacturing, that kind of thing. The role of housing, we spend a lot of time saying, okay, we can see what's going on in housing in the US. In the EU area, there's definitely been variation in the size of construction, the size of the run up in property prices in different countries. And in the end, I mean, the euro area and the euro system, we definitely have always a two-level analysis. One is top down, let's look at the aggregate euro area. But the one reason why we still have a very important role for the 20 member central banks is we have to understand through those national central banks, the variation across the member countries. So that structural differences are quite big in many ways across the EU area. So the bottom up kind of way of analyzing the EU area is also important, even if in the end we just have one monetary policy to run.
Catherine?
The only point that I would add is structural differences across countries ultimately does get manifested in different ways in which financial flows cross borders. And if to the extent that those financial flows are the main driver of exchange rate volatility, which then will have to feed into pricing decisions, feeding into pass through both the first stage and second stage, those structural differences do get manifested in higher dispersion of exchange rates. So I think it's more challenging to figure out a bright line between structural and shocks, because ultimately the exchange rate is the ultimate cross-border relative price. And it has a lot of inputs into it, and some of it's the structure in the different countries, and some of it is the shocks and how they are interpreted. But ultimately, it is the key transmission mechanism.
Thanks. Right here, please.
Hi, Fred Bergstedt. My question really goes to the topic of the next panel rather than this one, but I want to put it to Philip, and this is the only time he's on the platform. So I want to ask him, why, in your judgment, has the euro not assumed a greater role in international finance? As I understand the data, the euro's share of everything is roughly the same as the legacy currencies added up in the past. Why has not the euro, as many had predicted, taken a bigger share of global financial indicators?
Before Fred gets a reply from Philip, I should just note, we published the Peterson Institute 2 books, The Euro at 5, Ready for a Global Role, and The Euro at 10 with a similar title. And both of them, we predicted it would not. That was your prediction, Fred. Anyway.
So now I want to ask him, why were we right?
Well done.
So I mean, it's an interesting topic, and it's also interesting to think about the economics. Should we use these kind of share ratios as a relevant metric for anything? I mean, of course, it's interesting. So let me go over some basics here. One is European residents can conduct their lives in euro, and that's just so fundamental, as opposed to worrying about should I take a foreign currency mortgage. So it is not. People skip. I basically, whenever I'm on a panel or conference about the international financial system, people skip over how remarkable this is. So that's kind of, I think, the first order point. The second point, which I did allude to, is for the region, the euro is an international currency. So in terms of there's a lot of euroization, in the neighborhood of Europe. From our point of view, the fact that a lot of trade is invoiced in euro, not just from small countries, but it is important. So from the domestic point of view, how much you care about internationalization is how much does it affect you. There's a second type of internationalization, which is basically where you're basically a vehicle for kind of third-party transactions. That is there, but again, it's not so clear from a policy point of view how important that is. Let me mention one basic point, though, is the important role of the dollar in the world. This is a complete conjecture, but the fact that the euro is a pretty big second currency has meant the euro-dollar swap market is gigantic. So if I want to do something in euro, if I can raise finance in dollars, swap it into euro. So from the economic point of view, in terms of the footprint, if you like, of finance is relevant for the euro, a lot of that may take place in dollars because the swap market, because the problem with the data is you don't see, you have these surveys of swaps, but to have the perfect alignment of the swap data with the kind of currency of issue. So the currency of issue, the dollar is a very strong role, but that doesn't say that economically that if you like, is really pure dollar finance. If it's swapped into euro, of course, someone has to be on the other side of that swap. But I think that's very important in the dynamics of the European financial system. I can also tell you, going back 15 years, the Irish, the rapid growth of credit to the Irish system, which is a project, most of that was in dollars and in sterling. But the only reason they could raise so much dollars and sterling was because it was swapped out into euro, back to back. But mechanically, going back to gravity, Richard talked about gravity earlier on. Of course, for a country like Ireland, the big connections are with the London and New York. And is the fact that they could issue a lot of dollar bonds, sterling to some extent, and swap that into euro was fundamental to that particular credit bubble we had in that time. So what I would say is, in a world of derivatives trading, having a clean idea of the role of the dollar versus the euro or any other currency, you get a partial insight from looking at the kind of issuance data. In terms of the economics of it, I think you have to think about the swap market as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Fred for previewing our third panel after lunch, chaired by Joe Gagnon, will be about the dominance or not of the dollar. Did I see Harold? Yeah, could you give him?
Thanks. Harold James. I wanted to ask a question about the final observations of in Kristen's paper, but it was an issue that was really raised in every one of the contributions. That is that the advanced economies, the big economies, look different in terms of going to the inflation targeting story than emerging markets. But I wondered whether that was true in the past, and in particular, whether there isn't a case that if you're wildly unanchored, it's not a good idea to introduce inflation targeting just in the abstract, but that you could use the anchor as a glide path to get into the inflation targeting regime. And particularly, it seems to me that that's exactly the experience of the UK, that the EMS period was exactly that period of getting from unanchored expectations to a better regime that then made the inflation targeting possible. And actually, the Bank of England and the UK Treasury got Alan Greenspan to tell Mrs. Thatcher, who was opposed to the EMS, that it was a good idea to have a spine because Mrs. Thatcher listened to Greenspan. So I thought that was an example of exactly this trajectory that you might need.
Yeah, let's reverse the order. Catherine, please.
So Ted and I, over the years, have discussed inflation targeting. And my view was that it, mostly by giving you something to focus on to explain yourself, mattered. That the targeting part wasn't particularly valuable. It was, if there's a target, then I, as a central bank or a researcher about central banks or whatever, I have to explain what's going on in my economy and how I may or may not be reaching this target. There's nothing magic about having a target. Understanding the behavior of your economy, understanding the pressures, the dynamics, the spillovers, the this and the that, and having to write about it in an inflation report or a report of some other name, that was the key element in improving monetary policy. I don't think Ted disagreed with me, but maybe he does. He can say. But that to me, what matters about inflation targeting is not that you have one or not. It's how much do you use the anchor or whatever we want to call it, the evidence that you have a target. How much does that actually get deployed in giving policymakers a better understanding about why their economy is doing what they were doing, and therefore helping to achieve an objective? I put a lot more weight on the transparency and the research side of inflation targeting. And then I'm just going to finish my final comment is as we start to see the increasing volatility of the underlying and volatility and dispersion of the shocks that we've been observing over the last couple of years and will continue to observe, who explains that best? Not who has the best target, but who explains that best is going to determine to what extent we're going to be able to get back to our objectives. And I think it's going to be hard. I think it's going to be hard to do that, harder than the last 20 years. I think the final comment on that, and reason why I put that paper reference in my slides, is because I think we are looking at a regime change here, and we have to think about it in those terms. And we have to think about it at the micro price setting level of the firm.
Thank you. I don't know if the other monetary policymakers want to comment on that.
Jump in. This big picture, this conversation has made me think about how when Bretton Woods broke down, countries needed a new anchor for price stability. Some advanced economies have shifted to the model of independent inflation targeting central banks, combined with flexible exchange rates. That has worked well. Some have combined that with the euro area, as Philip has talked about. That has also worked fairly well. Emerging markets have also tried some different approaches. Some have maintained still fixed exchange rates, and that seems to have been correlated on average with better inflation performance. But then in the realm of the emerging markets that have adopted floating exchange rates, there's a real variance in success. Some have combined it with independent inflation targeting central banks and have done well. Others have combined it with inflation targeting central banks and been less successful. So I think some of the different outcomes, undoubtedly, I haven't done this formally, but undoubtedly they're partly at least linked to how independent the central bank is. Is it really an independent central bank that can do what it needs to do to target inflation? And my guess is if you went that next level in the analysis, that would be a key reason for some of the differences that I sort of highlighted very quickly for emerging markets. But Jose, you probably have more to add to that.
Just one small question to not take too much time. There is a confusion many times in the emerging markets. Inflation target is a strategy to run monetary policy in a stable country. It's not a disinflation strategy. Argentinians have tried to use inflation target with a huge fiscal imbalance. It's impossible. Macri tried, all of them have tried. So I think that is quite important. And indeed, inflation targets were adopted much later than Breton Butch. Inflation targets start 1999 roughly. So there was a long way, but a long way to stability, and then how we manage appropriately exchange monetary policy and for stable countries, inflation target in emerging market has worked.
Yeah. The alarm is going off. Let me just say a couple things beyond thank you to our very esteemed panel for engaging in such deep things. This is what happens, as with the previous panel, when you have the researcher policymakers come to the fore. For all the attacks on neoliberalism around this town, here at the Peterson Institute, we value people who combine mainstream economics with actual policy. Just two quick comments on the substance of last set of remarks. I want to echo, in a way, Catherine's remarks about transparency. Back in 1998, the late Thomas Laubach and I published a paper about German and Swiss monetary policy as an antecedent to inflation targeting. And we argued very strongly that the point was the transparency, and it gave you not an anchor in the sense Kristen rightly invoked Paul Volcker, but a anchor for expectations and communication that you could talk around. And that fed into the eventual book on inflation targeting. So just to say, I want to strongly associate myself with Catherine's view. The second point on that is through the years, going back to some of the classics at PIIE, in the chapter, the very limited chapter in inflation targeting book that Thomas and I drafted, and of course, Bernanke and Michigan oversaw, we talked a bit about Chile and Israel's transition to inflation targeting. And John Williamson published a book for the Peterson Institute. John Williamson published a book for the Peterson Institute on the crawling ban. And it is interesting, again, this just sort of illustrates the point some of the colleagues have raised, that what you had was over time, as the domestic anchor became stronger, the bands widened. As the bands widened and crawled upwards, you got more flexibility. And at some point, essentially the exchange rate band disappears, dissolves, and you're left with the inflation target. That worked for Israel and Chile, and to some degree for Colombia. And so again, going back to, I think it was Jose or Kristen who said, it works for a stable country. You had to have had the stabilization, the exchange rate based stabilization in Israel and other shocks, for example, to get to that option. But so it's very interesting to me, and I promise I'll shut up after this, to think about our colleagues who we're going to hear from in Japan, for example, who have to potentially get off of their yield curve control, whether this provides some interesting analogs they might think about. Anyway, with that, lunch is served. We encourage you to eat heartily, talk heartily, enjoy the break time heartily, and then at what time? Thank you, Jessica. At 1:30, we will reconvene for our third panel with Joseph Gagnon chairing. Thank you very much.